My name is Marek, and this is my office. It's a hole in a wall, 3 bricks wide, at the bottom of a mountain of rubble on Krochmalna Street. It smells of damp mortar and fear. Before dawn, when the sky is the color of a bruise, the wall has a breath. It exhales cold. You have to make yourself small to feel it, smaller than you think is possible. I am 11 years old, and I am very, very good at being small. My shoulders go first. I turn them sideways, press my cheek against the rough brick and push. The grit scrapes my skin. For a second, you are nothing. Just pressure and darkness, a body caught between 2 worlds. Then you spill out the other side, a ghost born into the empty streets of Warsaw, the Aryan side. You have to understand, the air is different here. It's thinner, colder. There's space in it. No scent of sickness, of too many people crammed into too few rooms. Here, there is only the faint smell of coal smoke from chimneys, a smell I barely remember. It's the smell of a world that is not starving. My heart is a rabbit in a cage, thump, thump, thumping against my ribs. My mission is simple. I carry a small cloth bag clutched in my fist. Inside are the last of my mother's zloty, folded into a tiny, precious square. With this, I will buy my family 3 more days of life. Maybe 4, if I am a good haggler. I stay in the shadows of the doorways, a little smudge of dirt and rags against the stone. My eyes scan everything, every window, every corner. This is the part of the job that isn't about being small, but about being invisible. A flickering candle flame can give you away. A dog's bark can be a death sentence. And then I hear it. The sound that freezes the blood. Boots. 2 sets of them, heavy, rhythmic, crunching on the cobblestones. A German patrol. I don't breathe. I melt into the recess of a locked storefront, making myself a part of the architecture of the night. They are close now. I can hear their voices, a low rumble of German I don't understand. I can smell the tobacco on their breath. One of them laughs, a sharp, ugly sound that cuts the silence. They are 20 feet away, then 10. My entire world shrinks to the space of that shadow. My mind is screaming, run, but my body is stone. I think of my mother's face, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. I think of my sister, Zofia, her stomach swollen not from food, but from the lack of it. They are the only reason I am here. They are the reason I cannot run. The boots pass. The sound fades. For a full minute, I don't move. I wait for the echo to die, for my heart to stop trying to crawl up my throat. Then, I unstick myself from the wall and run. Not a panicked run, but a swift, silent trot, my worn shoes making no sound. My contact is waiting in the usual place, a bombed-out courtyard behind a bakery. Jan. He's Polish, not much older than a boy himself, with nervous eyes that are always moving. He sees me and pulls me into the darkness. He told me I was late, his voice a harsh whisper. He snatched the bag of zloty from my hand without a word and counted it in the gloom. He handed me a sack in return. It was small but heavy. Potatoes? Maybe a handful of onions? The weight of it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. It was solid. It was real. It was life. Jan warned me the guards were taking bigger bribes tonight, that the price of everything would be higher tomorrow. He said I was lucky. Then he vanished. I was alone again, clutching my treasure. The sky was getting lighter now. I had to go. Back to the hole. Back to my world. I retrace my steps, moving even faster this time, the weight of the sack bumping against my leg. I can already taste the watery potato soup. I can already see Zofia's smile. I round the final corner, my eyes fixed on the pile of rubble that hides my entrance. And my heart stops. The German patrol. The same 2 soldiers. They are standing there. Right there. Not 10 feet from my hole in the wall. One is leaning against the bricks, lighting a cigarette. The other is looking up and down the empty street, his rifle held loosely in his hands. They are talking, laughing again. I am trapped. Trapped on the wrong side of the wall, with a bag of illegal food that will get me shot on sight. Behind me, the Aryan city is beginning to wake up. In front of me are the men who will kill me, and inside the sack in my hand is my family's breakfast. My office is closed, and I am locked out. But to understand why I was there, frozen in the shadows of the Aryan side, with the sound of German boots echoing in my bones, you have to see the day before. You have to understand the room. Our world had shrunk to the size of that room. Before the war, we had an apartment with 3 rooms, a kitchen with a window that caught the morning sun. My father, Jakub, was a tailor. He used to smell of chalk and thread and warm wool. Now, his workshop was gone. He was gone. And our world was a single damp space we shared with the Glickman family. 10 people in a room meant for 2. The air was always thick. Thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of dysentery, of fear. It was a smell you breathed in and never breathed out. It became a part of you. That morning, like every morning, I woke to the sound of my mother's breathing. Her name was Lena. Before, her breath was quiet, gentle. Now, it was a rasping sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of the fever that was burning her up from the inside. She lay on the thin mattress we shared, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her eyes, which used to be so bright, were sunken and cloudy. I dipped a rag in our precious bucket of water and laid it on her forehead. She barely stirred. Her lips moved, and I had to lean in close, my ear almost touching her mouth, to hear the words. She wasn't asking for medicine. We both knew that was impossible. She was asking about the bread, how much was left. Her voice was a fragile thread, but the question was as heavy as stone. It was the only question that mattered. I told her we still had a little. A lie. It was always a lie. You have to understand what a loaf of smuggled bread meant in that place. It wasn't just food. It was time. It was one more day. For a family of 3, a single loaf, if you were brutally careful, could be stretched for 2 days. The first day, you'd have a real slice each. The second, you'd crumble the rest into a thin, watery soup to trick your stomach into feeling full. So when my mother asked about the bread, she was really asking, how many more hours do we have? My sister, Shana, was awake. She was 7. She didn't cry from the hunger anymore. She was too weak for that. Instead, she sat on the floor in the corner, her small back pressed against the peeling wall. She was playing with a button. A small, chipped button that had fallen off my father's coat before they took him. She would push it across the floorboards, whispering to it, humming little songs. Her entire world, all her games and all her friends, had been shrunk down to that little circle of bone. She had my father's eyes, but they were too big for her face now. Her arms were like sticks. I could see the sharp points of her shoulders through her thin dress. Seeing her play with that button, it was like a knife in my gut, sharper than any hunger pang. This was why I went to the wall. Not for me. For the sound of my mother's breathing to continue. And for Chana to be able to push her little button across the floor for one more day. Our entire fortune, our only hope, lay in a small, hollowed-out book on the shelf. Inside was the last of our Polish zloty, real money, not the worthless paper the Germans made us use inside the walls. It was the money my father had hidden before they took him. I counted it, again, and again, as if counting it might make it grow. It wouldn't be enough. You have to understand the brutal math of it. First, you needed the zloty to buy the food on the Aryan side, where a potato was just a potato. Then, you needed more zloty for the bribes. Jan, my Polish contact, told me the guards were demanding more every day. The whole economy of survival was balanced on the price of food on one side of the wall and the greed of a guard on the other. That afternoon, I cooked our last potato. It was small and a little soft, with a dark spot I had to cut out. I boiled it and mashed it with water, making a thin gruel. I gave my mother most of it, spooning it into her mouth. She could barely swallow. I gave the rest to Chana, who ate it slowly, methodically, making every single drop last. I licked the pot clean. That was my share. When it was gone, a silence fell over our corner of the room. The potato was gone. The bread was a memory. The zloty in the book was not enough. There were no more moves to make. My mother looked at me. She knew. Her eyes were clear for a moment, the fever receding just enough for the fear to break through. She didn't ask me not to go. She couldn't. To ask me not to go was to ask us all to die. Instead, she whispered something else. She told me to be careful. She said my father would be proud. Her hand, thin and burning hot, reached out and brushed the scar on my cheek. That was it. That was the command. So I put on my oversized coat, checked the loose brick in the heel of my shoe where I kept the emergency zloty, and slipped the rest of the money into my pocket. I looked at Chana, still lost in her game with the button. I looked at my mother, whose eyes had closed again, her breathing returning to that terrible, rasping rhythm. And I left. I slipped out of the room, out of the building, and into the crowded, desperate streets of the ghetto. I walked toward Siena Street, towards the wall, towards the hole that was both my tomb and my family's only chance at a tomorrow. I made it back. Don't ask me how. For an hour, I lay flat in a half-demolished doorway on the Aryan side, the cobblestones digging into my ribs, listening to the German patrol laugh and smoke. Their voices were the soundtrack to my death. But they got bored. They moved on. And in the gray light, just before the sun rose, I slipped back through the wall like a ghost. The bread I brought back was a miracle. It was still warm. When I gave a piece to my mother, her eyes opened, and for a moment, the fever haze seemed to lift. She chewed it slowly, painfully, as if trying to memorize the taste. Chana ate her piece like a little animal, eyes wide, guarding it from the empty air. That loaf, bought with our last real zloty, and a terror that still coiled in my gut, was gone in 2 days. And that's when the real change began. The foundation of our life, as fragile as it was, started to crack. It began at the public soup kitchen, the one place that gave out something, anything, for free. The soup was mostly hot water with a few scraps of potato peel or barley floating in it. It was pathetic. It was a joke. But it was a joke that kept hundreds of people from dying each day. We stood in line for 4 hours. My mother was too weak, so I took our pot and waited with Chana holding my hand. The line snaked down the street, a silent, shuffling column of gray faces and hollow eyes. There was no energy for talking. The only sound was the shuffling of shoes and the occasional hacking cough that echoed off the tenement walls. You have to understand, that soup wasn't just food. It was a signal that the world hadn't completely forgotten us, that somewhere, some system was still working, however poorly. It was a spoonful of order in a world of chaos. When we finally got near the front, a murmur rippled back through the crowd. It wasn't an angry shout. It was worse. It was a sound of collective surrender. A man in front of me, a man with the shoulders of a blacksmith, but the frame of a scarecrow turned around. His eyes were defeated. He told me the pot was empty. They'd run out an hour ago. People just kept standing in line, hoping. I peered around him and saw it myself. The woman serving was just standing there, her ladle hanging limp at her side. Then, to prove the point to the disbelieving faces at the front, she scraped the ladle across the bottom of the giant metal cauldron. Scrap. It was the loudest sound in the world, the sound of absolute nothing, the final metallic verdict. The system was broken, the signal was gone. As the crowd dissolved, the whispers started. Rumors passed like currency. The Germans had cut the official rations again, not just cut them, eliminated them. The 180 calories a day, the spoonful of jam, the slice of bread so thin you could see through it. All gone. The pretense was over. Walking back to our room, holding Kana's small, cold hand, the street looked different. The desperation, which had always been a low hum in the background, was now a piercing shriek. I saw things I hadn't let myself see before. Or maybe they hadn't been there yesterday. A man was lying by a wall. He wasn't old. He was just finished. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his lips a thin, bloodless line. He was still breathing, but his body had already given up. He was a walking skeleton. One of the ones so consumed by starvation they had lost the will to even ask for food. They just stopped. I pulled Chana closer, shielding her face, but I couldn't look away. I saw his worn-out shoes, the same kind my father, Jakub, used to wear. I saw the faint outline of where a wedding ring used to be on his finger. He was somebody's father, somebody's husband. And in that horrifying, silent moment, I saw my own family. I saw my mother's pale face, her breathing growing shallower. I saw Chana's arms getting thinner every day. That man on the street wasn't a stranger. He was a warning. He was our future. That will not be my mother. That will not be Chana. The thought wasn't a prayer. It was a vow. That night, I sought out the older boys, the ones who ran the real risks. A boy named David, who was maybe 14 but looked 40. Told me what I already knew. Bread wasn't enough anymore. A single loaf was a fortune one day and gone the next. The only thing that mattered now was volume. Flour, potatoes, sacks of it. But the price on the Aryan side had doubled overnight. He told me the guards were demanding more, too. The risk was higher, so the price was higher. It's the simplest, cruelest math in the world. My usual run, my little hole in the wall, it wouldn't cut it. It couldn't earn enough. There was only one other way, a way the bravest or most foolish boys went. Through the sewers. A dangerous, disgusting, pitch-black maze where you could get lost, drown, or run right into a German patrol at an exit grate. David looked at me, at my small, wiry frame. He said it was a death trap. But he also told me the route. I went back to our room. The Glickmans were quiet in their corner. My mother was asleep, her breath a faint, ragged whisper in the dark. Chana was curled next to her, clutching the button from our father's coat. I stood there for a long time, the stench of the street, and the image of that dying man burned into my mind. The scraping sound of the empty ladle echoed in my ears. A loaf of bread was a meal. A sack of flour was a week. A week was a lifetime. The choice wasn't a choice at all. The entrance to the sewer wasn't a manhole, not a proper one. It was a collapsed section of a cellar floor in a bombed-out building, a jagged black hole that breathed a cold, foul air up into the ruins. David, the older boy, had shown it to me once. He'd pointed with a grim nod and told me the path was dangerous, but the patrols never looked there. He said you could go a kilometer under the ghetto walls if you knew the way. If. I stood at the edge, the small bag of zloty heavy in my pocket. This was it. The streets were a familiar danger. The wall was a known enemy. This was something else, a descent into the dark. I took one last look at the sliver of gray sky, breathed in the dusty air of the ghetto one more time, and lowered myself into the hole. The smell hits you first. It's a physical thing. It coats your throat, makes your eyes water. A thick, wet stench of human waste and decay and things I didn't want to name. You can't imagine it. Or maybe you can try. But you can't imagine choosing to walk into it. For a moment, my body refused. Every muscle screamed to climb back out, to run, to take my chances with the wall. But then I saw the face of the man on the pavement. His eyes wide and empty. I saw Chana's small hand, her knuckles like little white pebbles. I saw my mother's shallow breathing. I took the next step down. The water was knee-deep, ice cold. It soaked through my trousers instantly, a shocking, greasy chill that clung to my skin. I pulled a tiny stub of a candle and a match from a waterproof oilskin pouch, my most valuable tools. The match sputtered, failed. The second one caught. A tiny, flickering flame pushed the absolute darkness back a few feet, revealing a narrow, brick-lined tunnel curving away. It wasn't a tunnel you could walk in. It was a crawl space. The ceiling dripped with slime. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I started moving, one hand holding the precious candle, the other feeling along the slick brick wall. David's instructions echoed in my head. Count the junctions, the third one on the left, then straight until you feel the brick change to stone, then right. It sounded so simple when he said it. Down here, it was a prayer against getting lost forever. Rats were everywhere. Not just the sound of them, the skittering of their claws on the brick. I saw them, gleaming eyes in the darkness just beyond my candle's light. They were fat, fatter than anyone in the ghetto. They weren't afraid of me. Why should they be? I was just a small, trembling thing in their world. I tried to think of them as just animals. But in the dark, my mind played tricks. They were guardians of this stinking labyrinth. Twice, the candle flickered and almost went out as a drip of water hit the wax. Both times I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thought of being left in that total, suffocating blackness was a terror worse than any German patrol. The darkness down there felt alive. It felt hungry. After what felt like hours, my fingers brushed against a different texture. Stone, rough-hewn and colder than the brick. David was right. I took the turn, my body aching from the crouched position, my legs numb from the cold water. And then I saw it. A faint, vertical line of light ahead. A ladder. Climbing out onto the Aryan side was like being born into another world. I pushed the loose grate aside and scrambled into a quiet alleyway. I took a breath. A real breath of clean, cold air. It smelled of coal smoke and damp earth. It was the most wonderful smell in the world. I could hear a tram clattering in the distance, a dog barking. Normal sounds. Life. Jan was waiting. He saw me, and his face, usually a mask of business, showed a flicker of something else. Shock. Pity, maybe. He looked at the filth caked on my clothes, the sewer slime in my hair. He didn't say a word about it. He just took the zloty from my shaking hand and pushed a heavy cloth sack towards me. Flour. Maybe 10 kilos of it, more than I'd seen in a year. To us, it was a mountain of gold. It felt impossibly heavy. He told me to be careful. The patrols were everywhere today. His voice was a low whisper. Then he was gone. The journey back was worse. The sack of flour was awkward, heavy. I had to drag it, trying to keep it out of the filthy water. My candle was almost gone. I was moving on memory and sheer terror now, the darkness pressing in. But I had the flour. The thought of it was a shield. It was bread. It was soup. It was life. It was the opposite of the empty-eyed man on the street. When I finally pulled myself out of the cellar, back into the gray light of the ghetto, I collapsed onto the rubble, gasping. I was shaking, covered in filth, and colder than I'd ever been. But I had won. That night, our small corner of the room was filled with a smell I'd almost forgotten. The smell of food cooking. My mother, propped up on her mattress, used the last of our water and a tiny bit of the flour to make small, flat cakes on a piece of tin over our little stove. Her hands were weak, but her movements were sure. The Glickmans watched, their faces etched with a hunger so deep it was painful to see. My mother wordlessly handed them one of the cakes. When I took my first bite, it was warm. It wasn't much more than fried dough, slightly gritty. But it was the best thing I had ever tasted. I watched Chana eat hers, slowly, carefully, making it last. A little smudge of flour was on her cheek. My mother looked at me. She didn't smile. I think she'd forgotten how. But her eyes, for the first time in months, they weren't just filled with fever and fear. There was something else in them. A flicker of light. A fight. And in that moment, the stench of the sewer, the terror of the dark, the fat, slick rats, it was all worth it. For that one look, for that one warm, gritty taste of survival. The flour cakes were a memory. The brief, warm glow of my mother's smile was a lifetime ago. A week ago. It was July 22nd, 1942. A morning thick with summer heat. The air was heavy, promising a thunderstorm that never came. I woke up to the usual sounds, the Glickmans stirring in their corner, Chana's soft breathing beside me. But underneath it, there was another sound. A new one. A low rumble that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of trucks, many of them, and whistles. Sharp, shrill blasts that cut through the morning stillness like glass. Then came the screaming. It started on a nearby street and spread like fire, a wave of panic rolling through the ghetto. My mother sat bolt upright, the flush of her fever replaced by a waxy, bone-white pallor. Mr. Glickman was at the window, peering through a crack in the boarded-up frame. He whispered a single word. Action. An action. We all knew what it meant. You have to understand, the rules of our world, the brutal economy of hunger we had learned to navigate, it all vanished in an instant. The zloty hidden in my shoe were suddenly just worthless paper. The value of flour, of potatoes, of bread, it meant nothing. A new currency had been declared. The only thing of value now was your life, and the price of it was silence and invisibility. There was no time for thought. We had a plan. Every family had a plan. A desperate, flimsy blueprint for the day you hoped would never come. Ours was a small space in the attic, hidden behind a false wall at the back of a dusty storage closet. A showek, a hiding place. My mother, weak as she was, moved with a terrifying urgency. She grabbed Chana, who was still half asleep and whimpering, confused by the noise. The Glickmans gathered their two small children. We moved like ghosts up the stairs, every creak of the floorboards a cannon shot. We squeezed into the space, a coffin-sized pocket of darkness that smelled of ancient dust and rat droppings. 8 of us. Packed so tightly we were breathing each other's air. The heat was immediate, suffocating. Mr. Glickman slid the false panel back into place, and the world outside was reduced to thin slivers of light and muffled sound. We were buried alive. I found a small knothole in the floorboards of our hiding spot, one that gave me a sliver of a view into the apartment below ours, and from there, a fractured glimpse of the street. I became the eyes for our silent, terrified group, and I watched. I saw them first, the SS in their green uniforms, moving with a calm, terrifying purpose. But they weren't alone. There were others, Ukrainian guards in black and men in familiar blue caps. The Jewish ghetto police, neighbors, men I recognized. Their faces were stone. They were the ones banging on the doors, shouting for everyone to come out for resettlement. That was the word they used. Resettlement for work in the East. A new life. Bread and jam, the posters promised. It was a lie, and every soul in that ghetto knew it was a lie. I watched as the Kowalski family was dragged from the apartment I could see. Mrs. Kowalski was screaming, clutching a small suitcase. The guards tore it from her hands, its contents, a few items of clothing, maybe a family photograph, spilling onto the cobblestones. They were herded into the street, joining a column of people moving like sleepwalkers toward the edge of the ghetto. Toward the Umschlagplatz. The collection point, the train station, the economy of survival had changed so completely. Before, risk was a sewer pipe, a hole in the wall. The reward was food. Now, the risk was a single cough. A baby's cry. The reward was another minute of life, another breath. And then, the moment I will carry with me until the day I die. Chana started to cry. It wasn't loud. It was a small, terrified whimper, the sound of a 7-year-old girl who was hot and scared and didn't understand. In the absolute, crushing silence of our hiding place, it was a thunderclap. My mother's eyes, wide with horror in the gloom, met mine. Mrs. Glickman's hand flew to her own mouth, but I was the one who moved. My hand, filthy with the grime of 100 smuggling runs, clamped over my sister's mouth and nose. It was instinct, a brutal, animal calculation made in a fraction of a second. Her small body went rigid. Her eyes, huge and terrified, stared up at me. She struggled, her little fists beating weakly against my chest. She couldn't breathe. I was suffocating my own sister, to save her, to save us all. Through the floorboards, I could hear the heavy thud of boots coming up the stairs, banging on the door of the apartment below, shouting. My heart wasn't beating. It was a stone in my chest. I held on, pressing her face into my shoulder, my mind screaming a single word over and over. Please, please, please. Chana's struggling stopped. She went limp in my arms. The boots outside moved on. The shouting faded down the hall. Slowly, shaking so badly I could barely control my own limbs, I took my hand away. Chana gasped, a ragged, desperate sob of air. She didn't cry out again. She just stared at me, her expression a mixture of terror and a confusion so deep it broke what was left of my heart. I had become the monster in the dark to save her from the monsters in the street. In that moment, I wasn't a boy anymore. I was whatever you become when you learn the price of a single breath. The world had shrunk to the size of our showek, to the space between 4 attic beams, the smell of old wood, dust, and fear. The sounds of the action, the screams, the gunshots, the marching boots, had faded over the first 2 days into a terrifying, intermittent rhythm. Now, on the 4th day, a new enemy had arrived, one that was silent and lived inside our own bodies. Thirst. The heat in the attic was a physical thing, a blanket of dust and despair that settled over us, making it hard to breathe. We had a small canteen of water when we first climbed in here. We'd made it last 3 days, with tiny, measured sips that did little more than wet our lips. Now it was empty. The metal inside scraped when I shook it. My mother's fever had returned with the dehydration. Her skin was papery, her breathing a shallow rasp. She hadn't spoken since yesterday. Chana was worse in a different way. She lay curled in a corner, her small body perfectly still. Her eyes, usually so bright with some secret childhood game, were dull, like cloudy glass. She didn't cry or complain. The energy for that was long gone. Hunger you can fight. It's a loud, demanding beast, but you can bargain with it, ignore it for a time. Thirst is a different kind of monster. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It works its way into your head, drying up your thoughts until only one remains. Water. I watched Kana try to lick her cracked lips. I saw my mother's eyes, unfocused, staring at the empty canteen. And I understood a new, terrible truth. The Germans didn't have to find us. The Shoek, our fortress, was becoming our tomb. We could die of safety. The decision made itself. My hand over Chana's mouth had saved us from the soldiers. But my feet were the only thing that could save us from the silence. I waited for that strange, dead time in the late afternoon, when the summer sun was at its most brutal, and even the hunters seemed to rest. I touched my mother's shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. I held up the empty canteen. She didn't need to speak. I saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, something else. A desperate plea, the same look she'd given me when the last potato was gone. It was the look that had always sent me to the wall. I moved the false panel of the wall, the sound of wood scraping against wood deafening in the silence. I slipped out, not into the apartment, but onto the rafters of the attic. My old smuggling routes, the ones that took me over rooftops and through alleys, were useless now. The streets were death. But the ghetto was a city of layers, a city of cellars and attics and forgotten passages. My target wasn't the wall. It wasn't Jan or a bag of flour. It was a well, tucked away in the courtyard of a deserted tenement 2 blocks over. It was an old, disused well, but the older boys said it never ran dry. It was our only chance. Moving through the attics was like navigating a ghost ship. I crept over the rafters of my neighbors' homes, the homes of people I knew, the Glickmans, the Cohens, all gone. Through cracks in the floorboards, I could see into their empty rooms. A table still set for a meal that was never eaten. A child's toy lying on the floor. It was like walking through a city that had died in its sleep. I finally found a staircase at the far end of the block and descended into the twilight of an abandoned building. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The silence down here was different, heavier. I slipped out into a courtyard. The light was blinding. For a moment, I was paralyzed, exposed. The ghetto looked like a photograph of itself. Everything was still, frozen. A chair lay on its side. A page from a book fluttered in a weak breeze. There was no one. The emptiness was more frightening than the crowds had ever been. I moved, staying in the shadows, my body low to the ground. My old skills kicked in. Every doorway was a threat. Every window was a pair of eyes. Every corner could hide a patrol. I was no longer a boy with a sack. I was prey. And then I felt it, more than heard it. A vibration through the soles of my shoes. A rhythmic crunching sound. Boots. I dove behind a pile of rubble, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I peered through a gap. 4 of them. 2 German police in their crisp green uniforms, and 2 Ukrainian guards, their dark uniforms seeming to soak up the light. They weren't rushing, not chasing anyone. They were just walking, an occupying army in a city of ghosts. They held their rifles loosely, casually. That was the most terrifying part. This was just a job to them. They were between me and the well. My mind raced. The street was impossible. But I remembered something David, the older smuggler, had told me. A shortcut. A collapsed cellar that connected 2 buildings. I scurried back into the shadows, found the broken cellar door, and slipped into the earth. It was pitch black and smelled of damp soil. I felt my way along the wall, my hands brushing against stone and cobwebs. My wiry frame, the thing that made me such a good smuggler, allowed me to squeeze through a narrow gap in the foundation. I emerged in the cellar of the next building over, the one with the well. I waited, listening, for a full 5 minutes before daring to climb out into the courtyard. It was empty. The patrol was gone. The well stood in the center of the yard. It was old, with a wooden crank. I grabbed the bucket, its rope stiff and dry, and lowered it down. The sound of the chain clinking echoed unnervingly in the silence. Then a beautiful hollow splash. I pulled it up, hand over hand, the rope biting into my palms. The bucket was heavy, sloshing. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, clear, cool water. Before the war, it was just water. Now it was everything. It was a currency more valuable than gold, more precious than bread. This bucket of water was another day of life. Maybe 2. The journey back was a slow-motion nightmare. The bucket was heavy and awkward. Water sloshed over the side with every step, and each drop that hit the dusty ground felt like a stab wound. I couldn't run. I could only shuffle, trying to stay in the shadows, my ears straining for the sound of boots. When I finally pushed open the panel to our skoek, the relief was so intense my legs almost gave out. I didn't say a word. I dipped a small cup into the bucket and brought it to my mother's lips. She drank, her whole body shuddering. Then I gave some to Shauna, who sipped it slowly, her dull eyes finally focusing on my face. A flicker of life returned. My mother touched my cheek. Her hand was still hot, but there was strength in it. Her eyes were clear, and in them I saw something that terrified me more than any soldier. I saw that she knew. She knew the risks I'd taken. She knew what I was becoming. We had water. We were alive. But as I settled back into the suffocating darkness of our hiding place, I listened to the silence outside. A new kind of silence. The silence of emptiness. The action wasn't over. It was just getting more efficient. The silence came first. For weeks, our world had been a storm of noise. Gunshots, the rumble of trucks, screams that started high and ended abruptly, the barking of dogs, the shattering of glass. We had lived inside that storm, huddled in the dark of the shoek, our ears ringing with the sound of our own terrified heartbeats. Then, one day, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It pressed in on us. We waited a full day, then another. On the 3rd day, my mother, her face a pale, skeletal mask, nodded at me. It was time. Pushing open the false wall of the attic felt like opening a tomb. The air that hit us wasn't fresh, it was stale, thick with the smell of dust, rot, and a faint chemical scent I didn't recognize then. It was the smell of disinfectant, sprayed over the blood in the streets. We moved down the stairs like ghosts. The Glickmans, who had hidden in the cellar, were gone. Their door was splintered, hanging open. Inside, their single room was a hurricane of scattered belongings. A ripped pillow had bled its feathers everywhere, and they drifted in the air like slow-motion snow. Mrs. Glickman's prayer book lay torn on the floor. Outside, on Krochmalna Street, the world had been erased. It was our street. I knew every crack in the pavement, every loose brick, every doorway. But this was a different place. It was a photograph of our street, with all the people removed. Doors hung open like mouths frozen mid-scream. Windows were shattered. A child's shoe lay alone in the gutter. There was no one, not a single person. The ghetto, once so crowded you could barely walk, was now a vast, empty stage. The only sound was the crunch of glass under my shoes and a low moan from the wind, as it blew through the broken buildings. The silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of a vacuum, the sound of absence. My mother held Chana's hand so tightly her own knuckles were white. Chana didn't speak. She hadn't spoken much since the day I'd covered her mouth. She just stared, her eyes wide, taking in the emptiness. I walked a few steps ahead, my smuggler's instincts on high alert, scanning for patrols, for danger. But there was nothing to see. Only the debris of stolen lives. Then I saw it. Lying near the drain, half covered in grime, was a small painted wooden button. It was shaped like a ladybug. I had seen it 100 times, clutched in the hand of Chana's friend, a little girl named Leah from the next building. She was 6. She used to show it to Chana, telling her it was magic. I bent down and picked it up. The paint was chipped. It felt small and meaningless in my palm. And yet, it was everything. It was Leah's laugh. It was the game she and Chana played in the courtyard. It was a life. I closed my fist around it, the edges digging into my skin, and put it in my pocket. I didn't know what else to do. We made it back to our room. It was untouched, miraculously, but it felt different. The ghosts had followed us home. The emptiness of the street outside had seeped through the walls. Over the next few days, a few other survivors emerged, blinking in the daylight like us. Their faces were all the same, hollowed out, aged a decade in a month. From them, we pieced together what had happened. 300,000 people, they whispered. Gone. Sent east to a place called Treblinka. The word meant nothing and everything. And we learned about the new economy. You have to understand, before, our economy was built on a loaf of bread, on a smuggled potato. The currency was risk. Now a new currency had been issued. It was a single piece of inky paper, an Ausweis, a work permit. A man from a few floors down, a former leather worker named Steiner, showed me his. It was a simple card with a stamp on it. He worked at a German-owned brush factory now, he explained. The Germans needed brushes, so they needed him, for now. Those with the paper, the ones deemed productive, had mostly been spared. The old, the sick, the children, they were the first to go. Suddenly, everything was clear. The entire liquidation, the chaos, the terror. It was a brutal, monstrous act of accounting. They had audited our lives. They had sorted us into 2 columns, useful and useless. My father, the tailor, with his skills, might have been useful. Maybe. My mother, weak from the hunger sickness, was not. Chana, a 7-year-old girl, was not. And I, an 11-year-old boy. A smuggler, a ghost who knew the secret ways of the walls. I was worthless to them. That night, I watched my mother. She sat by the window, staring out at the empty ghetto. The worst of her swelling had gone down during our time in hiding, but the sickness had burned something away inside her. She wasn't just weak anymore. She was haunted. She looked at me, and her eyes didn't hold the desperate plea for food they once had. They held a new, colder terror. She understood the new math. She knew what our family was worth in this new world. Nothing. The fight for bread had been a war of cunning and speed. This was different. This was a war against a balance sheet. The prize wasn't a full stomach. It was the right to exist for one more day. The hollow relief of having survived was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty that the final ledger had not yet been closed. The Great Deportation ended on the Day of Atonement. A bitter joke from God, some whispered. But the silence it left behind was louder than the screams. Our world, which had been a cage, was now a tomb. The ghetto was shrunken, a scar of what it once was, and we, the ghosts, haunted its empty spaces. Krochmalna Street was no longer a river of people. It was a dry bed of dust and memory. You could walk from one end to the other and hear only the sound of your own footsteps, a hollow echo in a hollow world, passing the wild buildings, apartments left empty, their doors hanging open, their insides picked clean by desperate hands searching for a forgotten crust of bread or a splinter of wood to burn. I still prepared for my runs. The motions were the same, checking the loose sole of my shoe, the stitching in my coat. But the purpose had changed. Before, I was fighting hunger. Now I was fighting for a number, a life number. After the train stopped, the Germans counted us. Every survivor was given a Numerk, a number stamped on a flimsy piece of paper. That number was supposed to be your life, and that number got you the new god, a small document called an Ausweis, a work permit. If you worked in a German Shop, a workshop like Tobin's uniform factory or in the brushmaker's district, you were productive. You had a right to live. For now, if you were a child or sick or old, you were a statistic waiting to be corrected. My mother, my sister, myself, we were unproductive. We were a rounding error without a number. I saw it in the street. A man, his face gaunt, holding up his permit for a neighbor to see, his eyes burning with a terrible, triumphant pride. I saw the others, the ones without, who looked away, their faces turning to ash. This was the new currency. Not zloty, not bread, but a stamp that said you were useful enough not to be shot. Yet. One morning, before the sun had a chance to bleach the gray sky, I knew I had to go out again. Not for flour, not for potatoes. For a contact, a rumor, word from the Aryan side. Anything that wasn't this suffocating stillness. We had all heard the whispers about the Job, the Jewish combat organization, forming in the shadows. We knew we couldn't just wait for the next train. My mother was awake. She lay on the mattress, her body swollen from the hunger sickness, but her eyes were clear. They followed my every move. She didn't speak. We had stopped using words for things that were too large to carry. Chana was curled in a corner, her breath a shallow whisper. She was fading. Not crying, not complaining, just disappearing. From a small cloth bag, I took out the last of the bread I'd managed to get a week before. It was hard, stale, a rock of baked flour. Using all my strength, I broke off a tiny piece, no bigger than my thumbnail. The crack echoed in the room. I went to Chana and knelt. I pushed the piece of bread into her small hand and closed her fingers around it. She didn't respond. I leaned in close, my lips to her ear, and told her she had to eat. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a boy who had forgotten how to be a brother and only knew how to be a general in a war of 3 soldiers. Her eyes opened, just a slit. Slowly, she brought the bread to her lips. Watching her, I felt the small, hard shape in my pocket, the wooden ladybug button, Leah's button. And I understood something. You might think that in a place like that, hope dies first. But it doesn't. It just changes shape. It becomes smaller, harder. It's not a grand vision of liberation anymore. Hope is the texture of stale bread on your tongue. It's the sound of your sister's breathing, however faint. It's a wooden button in your pocket, a promise that a little girl named Leah once laughed on this very street. The Germans, with their lists and their trains and their Numerk, they thought they could turn us into numbers. They built an entire economy of death, where a life was worth less than a bullet. But they were wrong. Because survival is not a passive act. It's 1,000 tiny rebellions. Every calorie we consumed was an act of defiance. Every memory we held onto was a strike against their attempt to erase us. Every time my mother looked at me, and I saw not despair, but a silent command to live. That was a victory they could never understand. They could kill our bodies, but they couldn't kill that. I stood at the door. I looked back at my mother. She gave a single, slow nod. It was everything. It was permission. It was a prayer. It was the heaviest burden in the world. I slipped out into the dawn. The street was empty. I was just a boy, small and wiry, a ghost moving through a city of ghosts. But I was not a number. I was a memory keeper. I was a promise. The bread in my sister's stomach was a rebellion. The button in my pocket was a rebellion. My next footstep, and the one after that, was a rebellion. My name is Marek Abramovich, and my war was not over.